Gonzaga remains a darling in the computer metrics, but the resume did take a hit last weekend thanks to Wayne Tinkle and Oregon State's inability to win on the road. What does it mean for Gonzaga in terms of bracketology? We'll get to that on today's show.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Well, folks, as we've been doing on Tuesdays this season, taking a look at Gonzaga's AP poll situation. They're still in the receiving votes category. Didn't climb all that much. We'll talk about that. We also talk about their net ranking, kind of the resume, what games they have left, what teams could be moving up and down the quadrant system. And then for today, we're also going to take a look at some bracketology. There are tons and tons of people out there making their brackets. A lot of consistency in terms of where Gonzaga is currently being seated. We'll talk about that, what it means for Gonzaga, the best and worst case scenarios for them, how high we think they could get in the seeding and how low they could get. And then we'll also talk about some best and worst case scenarios in terms of projected opponents, teams they could match up well against, teams they maybe don't match up as well against. We'll get to that to close out the show. But we start with Gonzaga's small climb towards the AP Top 25. They received 5 votes in the AP poll last week, went out, beat San Francisco at home, a quality quad 2 win, certainly not a win that is comparable to, their win on Saturday, for example, against Pepperdine or some of the other, quad 3, quad 4 types opponents that they play. But between the win over San Francisco and then the huge 52-point blowout win over Pepperdine, it didn't exactly change a lot of minds in terms of whether Gonzaga should be in the top 25, nor should it have, I think. I mean, St. Mary's is not ranked. UCLA is not ranked. There are teams that are not only have beaten Gonzaga head-to-head, but just have better resumes than Gonzaga that weren't in the top 25. All told, the Zags received 14 votes from the AP voters. That's 9 more than last week. Obviously, again, with the 2-0 week with the wins over San Francisco and Pepperdine. This week, Gonzaga will get a chance to win a road game against Washington State, as well as a home game against St. Mary's, quad 2 at Wazoo, quad 1 at home against the Gales. Wins there, you go 2-0 in that week. Suddenly, maybe you're not quite in the top 25, although I wouldn't be surprised if Gonzaga jumps all the way in that situation. But you're certainly a heck of a lot closer than you are right now. The Zags were the second lowest among all vote getters. The only other team that received less votes than Gonzaga was High Point, who received 1 vote from the AP voters. St. Mary's had 63 votes. Gonzaga's many of their other opponents, Baylor, San Diego State, Indiana, West Virginia, none of them received any votes in the AP poll. In fact, the only team that is in the AP Top 25 that Gonzaga has played this year is Kentucky. Mark Pope and the Wildcats fell 2 spots from 15 to 17. UCLA received 56 votes. UConn received just 20 votes after losing at Seton Hall. So they're pretty close to Gonzaga in the standings in terms of receiving votes. But for Gonzaga, a schedule that looked so unbelievably promising at the start of the season: Baylor, San Diego State, UCLA, Kentucky, UConn. This was just a slam dunk, no doubt, non-conference schedule for Gonzaga. And here we are. They've only played one team that is currently in the AP Top 25. Just goes, you don't know exactly what you're getting every single season going into college basketball. While the AP voters weren't incredibly impressed with Gonzaga's 2 wins last weekend, it did help them in the computers. They've been a darling at net and KenPom and Torvik all season long. That's not new. These metrics love Gonzaga's, the fact that they haven't been blown out in any of their games, the fact that they do have blowout wins themselves, have really kind of helped carry Gonzaga's resume from a metrics perspective. They actually climbed from 14 to 10 in the net rankings. I'm recording this on Monday afternoon. The net rankings, for those who don't know, update every single day. So there's a good chance Gonzaga will not be 10th by the time you're listening to this show. But as of Monday afternoon, Gonzaga is number 10 in the net rankings. Do I think Gonzaga is one of the top 10 teams in college basketball? No. Do I think the committee will treat Gonzaga like a top 10 team in terms of seeding? No, absolutely not. But the net is a valuable tool utilized by the selection committee, and Gonzaga is currently 10th. Every single team ahead of Gonzaga has 5 or less losses except Arizona, who, as I'm recording this, currently is 9th. in the net rankings with 8 losses. I say that because Arizona is playing Baylor in about an hour from the time I'm recording this. By the time you're listening to this, that game will have happened. From a Gonzaga resume perspective, a Baylor win, very important for Gonzaga so they can hold on to being a quad 1 win for the Zags, but it could potentially mean Arizona is further down this list by the time that game rolls around. In fact, it could mean Gonzaga moves all the way up to 9, considering a win for Baylor would help Gonzaga's resume even more. Zags have the fewest quad 1 wins among teams, not only in the top 10, but in the top 25. In fact, in the top 30. The next team with 2 or less quad 1 wins is VCU, the Rams, who are 1-1 in quad 1 games, and they are 34th in the net rankings right now. So the Zags' margin of loss is basically what's carrying them. They've played a lot of pretty good teams, and they've only lost to them by a few points. That is basically the strength of their resume. 38-point win over Baylor, very helpful. Nice win over San Diego State, very helpful. No real bad losses is also helpful. The Santa Clara loss is not good, but I wouldn't categorize it as a bad loss necessarily. It being at home certainly does not help. But for Gonzaga, their resume is being carried by things that typically aren't as important to the actual human people putting together the NCAA tournament picture. So it'll be interesting to see how they kind of reckon with this as we are now just about a month out from when that will take place. Gonzaga also 11th at KenPom, ahead of Arizona, ahead of Michigan State, Michigan, Marquette, Kentucky, St. Mary's, ahead of a whole bunch of teams. Outside of 10 teams, they're ahead of everybody. Again, KenPom has always really valued Gonzaga's offensive efficiency, which has really helped kind of keep them in a high spot. And like the net, it values the fact that they haven't been blown out in any of these games and things of that nature. For Gonzaga, their resume did change a little bit, not just because they picked up a quad 2 win over San Francisco at home, and of course the quad 4 win over Pepperdine at home as well. But Oregon State went to the Chiles Center, and even though that's only like an hour and a half, if that, ride from Corvallis to Portland, a little farther than that. Anyway, this team really struggles on the road. They've struggled on the road all year long. They had a 21-point loss to LMU. They go to the Chiles Center in Portland and lose, and they went from 66th in the net all the way to 76th in the net. Then they went out and beat Pacific, but not by very much. They fell one more spot. As I'm recording, 77th in the net right now. That's a big deal for Gonzaga because that road game against Oregon State, which they lost at the Gill Coliseum, was a quad 1 loss when Oregon State was a top 75 team. Currently, Oregon State is 77th. Again, by the time you're listening to this, maybe they're 75th again and all is good. But right now, that loss has become a quad 2 loss for Gonzaga. It also means their win over Oregon State, which was a quad 2 win, is now a quad 3 win. So as it stands right now, Gonzaga is 2-5 in quad 1 games. Their wins being Baylor and San Diego State. Their losses being West Virginia, Kentucky, UConn, UCLA, St. Mary's. They are 3-2 in quad 1 games, with their wins being Arizona State, Indiana, and San Francisco. Their losses being Oregon State and Santa Clara, both of those now in the quad 2 category. They're 4-0 in quad 3 games, 11-0 in quad 4 games, taking care of business there. In terms of what could change, obviously Oregon State. Were they to get back into the top 75? That would become a quad 1 loss as opposed to a quad 2 loss for Gonzaga, which is a good thing. It would also, the quad 3 win would become a quad 2 win. So Gonzaga would add a quad 2 win. They'd add a quad 1 loss or subtract a quad 2 loss and move it to the quad 1. So that's a huge potential swing for Gonzaga's resume. Adding a quad 2 win is important. Having that loss be quad 1 as opposed to quad 2 is important. Now for Oregon State, their remaining schedule does not inspire a ton of confidence, unfortunately. They're at Pepperdine and at San Diego. Neither of those games are very likely to help Oregon State move up in the net rankings, and they're far more likely to hurt Oregon State, who, again, really struggles on the road. I don't think they lose either of those games, but if they win both of them by 15, the odds of them moving up in the net are fairly low. They'd probably still move down, frankly. That's why these bottom feeder teams really drag you down, because you got to beat them by like 30 in order to move up in the net. And Oregon State's not going to beat these teams by 30 on the road. Then they host San Francisco. That's a huge game. I'm going to be in the building for that game. I'm really excited about it. That's a big time game for Oregon State. If they win that one, they hold home court. Let's get that right against San Francisco. That could be what pushes them back into the top 75. It could also potentially knock San Francisco closer to being not a quad 1 win or a quad 1 opportunity for Gonzaga to close out the season. So a lot of balls in the air, a lot of things we're juggling at that point. But for Gonzaga, again, as I'm recording this right now, Baylor and Arizona have not tipped off their big Monday game. Baylor's 28th in the net right now. If they win this game, they'll probably either move up or at least stay where they are. If they lose this game, if they get blown out, then I think we start to worry that Baylor maybe falls outside the top 30 and then Gonzaga loses that quad one win. If they win or if they play a close game, they probably still stay in that top 30 conversation. Other team to keep an eye on, Indiana. They're 57th right now in the net. If they get into the top 50, that quad two win that Gonzaga has over them from Battle for Atlantis would become a quad one win as a neutral site game. So we're rooting for the Hoosiers to have a strong finish to the season, to play well down the stretch now that they know their coach is going to be replaced at the end of the year. Get in the top 50, give Gonzaga another quad one win on the resume. And then as for what's left for the Zags, 4 games in the regular season. Their next game at Washington State is a quad 2 game. The final 3, quad 1, St. Mary's at home, at Santa Clara, at San Francisco. Boom. That is it. 1 quad 2, 3 quad 1. You'll probably get quad 2 and quad 1 opportunities in the WCC tournament. So there is a lot of opportunity for Gonzaga to still boost this resume with plenty of time until the actual selection committee gets together. So that's what we want to talk about now, because right now, all of the bracketologists, they're pretty much in agreement with where Gonzaga should be placed. And it's not really a great spot to be, particularly if you're trying to keep a Sweet 16 streak and extend it to 10 years. We're going to talk about that coming up in just a second. But first, folks, nowadays, Taxes is easily uploading your forms to a TurboTax expert who's matched to your unique tax situation. An expert who's backed by the latest technology, which cross-checks millions of data points for 100% accuracy. While they work on your taxes, you get real-time updates on their progress, and you get the most money back guaranteed, all while you go about your day. No stressing, no worrying, no waiting. Now, this is Taxes with Intuit TurboTax. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service. Real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantee. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. We're still talking bracketology here, 1 month out from Selection Sunday and the start of March Madness and the NCAA Tournament. So lots of excitement, lots of different bracketologists out there making their projections, their predictions for how this thing's going to shake out 1 month from now. So what I want to do now is kind of just talk about where those projections have Gonzaga, what that means for Gonzaga, and then we'll close out the show taking a look at some of the kind of best and worst case scenarios the Zags could find themselves in. And I'll say this again, I said it at the top, but I think it's an important thing to recognize about this Gonzaga team this season. They're a weird team to pin down. I can't come up with a better word than weird. They're just a unique resume versus eye test versus like strength of schedule versus like there's just a lot of uniqueness. There's a team that went out and played what was, completely agreed upon as a very strong non-conference schedule. They went out and beat teams that people thought were going to be really, really good this year in Baylor and San Diego State. They went out and lost very close, heartbreaking games to teams that most projected at the time of those games were going to be top 10 or top 15 teams. They lose to Kentucky in a game they were leading by 16. They lose to UConn at the time when UConn was, still a perennial top 25 team and not what they are at this point, which is closer to the bubble than a lot of people would like to admit. They beat a UCLA team that was ranked at the time, but has really stumbled pretty much right after that game. And so this is just a team that, Indiana, a lot of people weren't super high on them, but we expected them to be better than they have been at this point. And so that win hasn't really aged well for Gonzaga either. And so you have this resume where Gonzaga did what they were what people wanted them to do. They went out, they scheduled a tough non-conference schedule. They blew the doors off the first team they played. They looked the part. They lost a few close games. And you're thinking, okay, the computers still like them because the offense is still top 5 in the country in offensive efficiency. The defense has fluctuated, but at times has looked very good. A lot of teams struggle early in the season. This team's struggles have been 1 to 2 possession losses to top 10, top 15 teams. So you kind of get into conference play feeling like, all right, Gonzaga's fine. It's heartbreaking that they didn't win any of those huge games that we wanted them to win. It's heartbreaking that all those losses happened the way that they did, but they're going to be okay. And then they go out and they give up 97 points to Oregon State at the Gill Coliseum, and you're thinking, okay, now we got a bit of an issue. And then they just get absolutely boat raced by Santa Clara, give up 103 points at the McCarthy Athletic Center, and then you start having some real problems for this team. But the metrics at that point didn't they still valued Gonzaga. They still valued what they had done. And so you're looking at the committee they're going to get sheets on Selection Sunday. They're going to be handed sheets or packets with information that they're supposed to use to determine the seeding for the NCAA tournament. Ken Palm's data, the net rankings, and Bart Torvik's T rank are all on those sheets. So when I continue to reference the fact that Gonzaga is 10th in the net, or 11th at Ken Palm, or 15th at Torvik, which is where they are as of this recording, it is because those are legitimate used metrics by the committee. But again, the committee also has eyeballs, and they also know that this team has some ugly losses in the WCC. They know that this team, didn't pick up as many of the major wins as they could have. They know that, yes, while this team lost a lot of close games, and that's why the computers like them, they also didn't win very many close games and haven't up to this point, at least in the season. So you're looking at a team that's 2-5 in quad one with Baylor, who's a kind of a bubble team, 8-9 seed range, similar to Gonzaga, and San Diego State, who is a bubble team. A lot of projections have them as a play-in game. Like, those are your best wins. And again, losing close games may be valuable to the computers, but it's not really valuable in real life. So I think that's what makes Gonzaga such a unique team that I'm very interested. I almost wish I had less of a rooting interest in Gonzaga's seed line, because I'm kind of fascinated by how the committee is going to handle them. But at this point, the projections are pretty firm with where they believe Gonzaga is going to be. And these are just people making projections. Like, it's not the actual committee members. But I pulled a handful of bracketology reports, many from Friday, some of them that updated on Monday. And Gonzaga was very, very consistent among the bracketologists that I respect and that I read fairly regularly. We'll start with the most well-known bracketologist, Joe Lunardi, on his Friday update. He had Gonzaga as an 8 seed, taking on a number 9 seed in New Mexico out of the Mountain West Conference. Lunardi updates every Tuesday and Friday. So again, by the time you're listening to this, he probably has done a refresh on Tuesday. I will post on social media what the difference is for that. But as of this recording on Friday, his latest update, Gonzaga is an 8 seed taking on a 9 seed in New Mexico. Rocco Miller, who does the Bracketeer.org, is a phenomenal resource for college basketball, West Coast guy, friend of the program. His most recent was on Monday, updated more recently than Lunardi. And guess what? He has Gonzaga as an 8 seed taking on a number 9 seed New Mexico team out of the Mountain West Conference. Some consistency there. Jerry Palm at CBS Sports, you're going to love this. He has Gonzaga as a 9 seed, not an 8 seed, taking on an 8 seed New Mexico out of the Mountain West Conference. 3 of the 5 brackets that I looked at has Gonzaga as either an 8 or a 9 seed playing New Mexico. By the way, New Mexico, tough matchup. Donovan Dent is probably the best guard on this side of the Mississippi that is not named Ryan Nembhard. He is phenomenal. They have Nelly Jr. Joseph in the front court, 2 phenomenal players. Richard Pitino, the head coach there, Rick Pitino's son. This New Mexico team, their resume, they haven't played a ton of great teams. The Mountain West is kind of down this year. They lost to St. John's. They lost to Arizona State, which obviously is a team Gonzaga was able to beat, but they're a very good team and would not be a super fun team to have to play in the first round of the NCAA tournament. 2 other brackets that came out, Mike DeCourcy at Fox and Lucas Harkins at Heat Check College Basketball, 2 that I really respect as well. They both have Gonzaga as a 9 seed. Both of them have them playing an 8 seed that's not New Mexico, but another West Coast team, the Ducks of Oregon, Dana Altman's club. That would be a really interesting matchup. Obviously, Gonzaga, Oregon have not played each other an extremely long time. Would be very fun to see those 2 kind of West Coast powers get a chance to go at each other. Gonzaga and Oregon did play each other a few years ago. I think it was like 5 or 6 years ago now in one of the Feast Week tournaments. I just remembered that. So they have played each other fairly recently, but they don't play each other much. That's for sure. And this Oregon team, young team, Nate Biddle, their starting center, was a guy Gonzaga recruited alongside Ben Gregg. Ended up going with Gregg. Biddle goes to Oregon. So it'll be fun to get a chance to compete against him. TJ Bamba used to play at Washington State, transferred to Villanova, transferred back to Oregon. This is a potentially fun matchup for Gonzaga. They're a very good team. And it would certainly be a difficult one, but that's kind of the nature of being in the conversation for an 8-9 seed. And I think it's pretty obvious why this is not the ideal draw. Not necessarily because of the first round matchup. Whoever Gonzaga plays in the first round is going to be a decent team. They're not going to get a top 3 seed where you end up playing a mid-major that you generally can out-athlete. Gonzaga's not in a position to do that. So we'll see what this looks like. But the main issue with being an 8-9 seed is that your second round game, your chance to get to the Sweet 16, you got to get through a 1 seed. And that is really difficult to do, especially this year where your 1 seed's very likely going to be Alabama, or I should say them in order, Auburn, Alabama, Duke, and Florida most likely, maybe Tennessee, maybe Texas A&M sneaks in there, maybe Houston sneaks in there. But ultimately, Auburn, Bama, Duke very much locked into the top 3 seeds, barring catastrophic ends of the season for them. And those teams are just absolute loads, really difficult matchups for Gonzaga, for anybody in college basketball. So if you get an 8-9 seed for Gonzaga and your main hope, your main goal for this season is, I just want to keep the Sweet 16 streak going, I'm going to tell you right now, it would be a pretty tough thing for them to accomplish, to keep that Sweet 16 growing, Sweet 16 streak growing, if they end up getting an 8 or a 9 seed. So what are some of the best and worst case scenarios for Gonzaga in terms of seeding and in terms of matchups for the NCAA tournament? We're going to talk about that to close out the show coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, get ready to bring your favorite Zags to life. VarsityIcons.com delivers the ultimate collection of action figures that honors both current and former Zags. Varsity Icons is the premier sports collectible figure for your Gonzaga Bulldogs. Today, we highlight everybody's fan favorite, Ben Gregg. Varsity Icons was started by a longtime Gonzaga fan who wanted to create collectible figures of everyone's all-time favorite Zags. The mission of Varsity Icons is to create figures of current and former Zags for everyone to collect and enjoy. There's no question that Varsity Icons wanted to highlight Ben Gregg to be their first player. He has been a fan favorite since joining the Zags back in 2021. Ben exemplifies what it means to be a Gonzaga Bulldog every time he steps on the court. We are excited to create more of your favorite Zags in the future, so stay tuned. Order your Varsity Icons Ben Gregg figure today at varsityicons.com. That's Varsity Icons, where icons live forever. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, still talking bracketology with 1 month until Selection Sunday. We talked about where the current projections have Gonzaga pretty much exclusively as an 8 or a 9 seed. The 5 brackets that I looked at all had Gonzaga playing either New Mexico or Oregon. Again, this is all going to change on a day-by-day basis as we collect more data about this actual season. But that's where Gonzaga's at right now. So what I want to do now is talk about what are the best and worst case scenarios for the rest of the season for Gonzaga, and what would that do to them from an NCAA tournament seeding perspective. So we'll start with the best case scenario. The best case scenario, fairly simple for Gonzaga: win every other game, win the rest of the season. Win your 4 regular season games, your game at Wazoo, win your 3 quad 1 games against St. Mary's at home, against Santa Clara, against San Francisco on the road. Win the WCC tournament, so you beat probably San Francisco or Santa Clara again, then you beat St. Mary's in the championship game. You do all that. San Francisco and Santa Clara stay quad 1 games. Baylor stays a quad 1 game. Oregon State moves to a quad 1 game. If all of that happens from a net perspective, Gonzaga would have a 6-6 record in quad 1 games. They would be 5-1 in quad 2. And that resume would be top 10 in the net. Almost certainly they're top 10 in the net right now. And if they do that, they're very likely going to be in that conversation. They'd probably be top 10 at Ken Pom. So you're talking about a 500 record in quad 1 games, 6 quad 1 wins, top 10 net, top 10 Ken Pom. I think realistic top end scenario is a 6 seed for Gonzaga. I think that there is like an outlier possibility of a 5 seed. Like, I think that is the highest potential outcome, but it's like 99 something percentile outcome for Gonzaga. Whereas a 6 seed is a much more realistic, but still high end outcome for Gonzaga. If Gonzaga wins every game that they play for the rest of the season, I'm not saying that's likely necessarily, but I'm saying if it were to happen, that it would be hard for me to see this team honestly as less than a 6 seed. I could see a 7, but if they were an 8-9 seed, while winning out this season, I think that would be a little bit of a disservice. Again, it's going to depend on what else happens. Like, we'd have to see a full picture of the rest of the NCAA tournament picture and which teams got seeded ahead of them and things like that. But my likely projection here is that if Gonzaga were to win out, even if some of the other things didn't fall their way, even if Oregon State didn't end up quad 1, even if Gonzaga wins the next 4 games in the regular season and wins the WCC tournament, I think they get a 6 seed. I think a 7 seed is a likely outcome if they, win out, but then lose in the WCC tournament, or even if they lose one more game, even if they win out all the way and Baylor and Oregon State both stay quad 2 games and their resume just doesn't quite look as good, I could see maybe a 7 seed. But I think that a general consensus best case scenario is you get that 6 seed, and you get a matchup where You're playing an 11 seed. You're potentially playing a team that had to do a play-in game, in which case they will have just played 2 days prior, whereas you had a bigger gap. Then you win that game. You play a 3 seed. Then you play a 2 seed. Your path to getting to the Sweet 16 is significantly higher as a 6 seed than it would be as an 8 seed. Even as a 7 seed, you only got to get through a 3 seed to get to the Sweet 16 as opposed to a 2 seed. This year, the difference between 2 and 3 seeds is actually fairly, depending on the teams, feels like it could be a pretty big difference for Gonzaga, depending on the matchups, of course. The obvious worst case scenario for Gonzaga is they lose the rest of their games. I don't think that's very likely. I think that if we're talking about a 5 seed being like the 99 plus percentile outcome, losing the rest of your games and not making the tournament is like way down at the 1/2 percentile likeliness. I just don't think that's going to happen. I do think if Gonzaga were to lose all 4 of the remaining regular season games, they would probably not finish top 2. They wouldn't finish top 2 in the WCC. So then they wouldn't get that double bye. And then if they lost their first game in the WCC tournament, this is the absolute drop dead worst case scenario. If that were to happen, yes, 5 straight losses for Gonzaga to end the season, they probably don't make the dance. In fact, I'd be very surprised if they did at that point, but that's not going to happen. That is like a super unrealistic situation for this Gonzaga team to find themselves in. More likely, I think you're looking at like maybe the Zags split the final 4 regular season games, which would be bad. Like that would be a worst case type scenario. But if you split them, if one of them's the Wazoo game, that's a quad 2 loss. That hurts. And then you lose one of the other quad 1s. You still get two quad 1 wins. Again, some of those could potentially move and shift a little bit, but I could see a situation where Gonzaga's more realistic worst case scenario is something like a play an 11 seed game, or even just like a regular 11 seed or a 10 seed. I think that's kind of the worst case scenario that's in the realistic realm is 11 seed or 10 seed. Or, I mean, honestly, I'd almost rather be a 10 seed than a 9 seed. It's just such a brutal place to be. But I kind of think that's the more likely worst case scenario is like you win 3 of the 4 regular season games, but you lose the same areas. You lose the same areas again in the WCC tournament. You're like 3-7 in quad 1 games, 4-2 quad 2. Like your resume is kind of blah, but it's still enough to get into the tournament. And then in terms of some potential like team matchups, this is just kind of off the cuff, looking at the brackets that we have at this point and the projections and kind of looking at teams that could realistically be matched up against Gonzaga, teams that they haven't played before. They're not going to match Gonzaga up against Baylor or UConn or San Diego State, even though all those teams are realistically in the 8-9 seed conversation. They're not going to match Gonzaga up with them. So we'll just throw them out for right now. But some of the ones that could be realistic that I think would be ideal for Gonzaga, there's 2, Oklahoma and BYU. We'll start with Oklahoma. They're talked about as a 9 seed right now. They've lost 4 straight. I'm not sure they're going to end up. They're 3-9 in the SEC. And I get the strength of the SEC. I understand it. I talk about it all the time on Locked On College Basketball. This is a conference that legitimately probably deserves to have 11 teams in the NCAA tournament. But I also have a hard time looking at a team that's 3-9 in conference play and thinking, yeah, they should get in. Like I have a hard time. Regardless, if Oklahoma were to be an 8 or 9 seed against Gonzaga, I like that matchup for the Zags. They're a decent 3-point shooting team, but they're mediocre on defense. They have one really great player, freshman Jeremiah Fears. He's great at putting pressure on the rim. He's going to get to the free throw line. He's a potential problem for Gonzaga, but he's their only really good player. I think Gonzaga would be pretty happy with Oklahoma being the team lining up against them in a first-round game. Also, BYU. I could see it as a 7-10 where Gonzaga's the 7, BYU's the 10. I could even see it as a 6-11 in a best-case scenario for Gonzaga in that case. BYU's a team that they're playing better lately, but they're not a very good defensive team. They're a young team. They get out and transition a lot. They like to run. They are a good offensive team, but they struggle defensively. I think Gonzaga matches up well with them from a size perspective. I just don't think that they're a team that would be talented enough to beat Gonzaga unless Gonzaga were beating themselves. And I think a matchup, it'd be very fun to get a chance to play BYU in the NCAA tournament. So that's part of the reason they're on this list as well. Some of the not good matchups Gonzaga could face, I would be terrified to see Creighton. The latest projections I see have Creighton up as a 7 seed. So I think that's an ideal situation. Gonzaga and Creighton are both 7 seeds, so they don't have to deal with each other, because if Gonzaga is playing Creighton, I think that's a bad matchup for Gonzaga. Ryan Kalkbrenner, such a problem. 3-time Big East Defensive Player of the Year, the best two-way center in college basketball. He's an absolute load. He would score effortlessly on Graham Ike, and he would make life very difficult for Graham on the other end of the floor. This Gonzaga team is very neutralized if they can't score in the front court. The fact that Greg McDermott knows Brian Nembhard better than any coach in college basketball, it's not Mark Few, would make that a very nightmarish matchup for Gonzaga. And then Clemson's another team I see floated around the 7-8 potential seed line range. I could see that being a matchup given to Gonzaga, and I would hate it. Clemson's really good. They're a really good rebounding team. Ian Shefflin's a load in the front court. They have very old, experienced, talented guards, guys who can create their own shot, who can take guys off the dribble. I think it's a matchup nightmare for Gonzaga as well. So if you're looking at some potential teams you want to see Gonzaga line up against, avoid Creighton, avoid Clemson. Feeling a little bit better if we end up with Oklahoma or BYU against us in that first round game. It's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. We'll be back on Wednesday's show with a big old preview of that game in Pullman against Washington State. We'll recap that game and then get you ready for the big one on Saturday in Spokane against Randy Bennett and the Gales of St. Mary's. Thanks again for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Have a fantastic rest of your day. And as always, go Zags.